In this session, we are going to look at static variables and methods. Static keyword is associated at class level. We have done some programs like where we used, especially the main method, which is a static, and we have developed some methods before, which is all static methods like is prime, reverse number. So all these methods, whatever we have developed sometime before, are all static methods. So static basically is associated at the class level and it is not associated with the instance level. So what I mean here is, you have a person class and person is having some properties. Those properties are all instance properties. That means it is for each person they are going to have different values in it. But static is at class level. It is being shared with all the instances of a class. Let's look into more detail with the help of the program. But as such, understand like static is a keyword and it can be associated only at the class level and it is not at instance level. So static can be used with static keyword can be used with variables, methods, blocks, and nested class. So we are going to look at how we can use static with variables and methods in this session. We will later cover how can we use static blocks and nested classes in the later sessions. So as I said, it refers to the common property of all the objects. It's shared across all the objects. It is not associated with the one object. It is basically associated with all the objects of a particular class. It's shared basically. And then they are not kind of unique for each object. Let's say for a person class, you have a property called first name. That first name is not a property of a class, but it's mostly associated with an instance basically. So each person will have his own name, own first name, and but the static property is not like that. It is not for an individual person object, but it is going to be for a class. Static variables are allocated memory only once because again it comes to because it is shared. It is not for each instances, but it is for a class. The memory is created for a class. The static variable one memory allocation is allocated. But in case of objects, for each instance you create, memory is allocated for each of these properties. So static variables memory will not be created each time when you create an instance. Okay, we'll see the usage of static with the help of a program. So this is our normal program where we have a person class and we had first name, last name, age, and they are basically the instance variable. And then we had some behaviors where we have get full name, which will be working on the instance variable. These are the instance methods which works on the instance variable and provide some behavior here. So we have get full name, we have is eligible to vote, which we have already taken a look in the previous sessions. I have added one more method which is add person. This method is just going to receive three arguments, which is fn, which is first name, ln last name, and n is the age. So it's going to receive three arguments, and once it receives, it is going to put that into the instance variable. Whatever it receives from any other program, it just assigns that to the instance variables. So these are all the instance method. Why we call it as instance method? Because they are not having static in it. So they are basically associated with the instance of a person. They are associated with person objects and not the person itself, not the class itself. So they are called instance methods. If at all a method has a static, then it is called as a static method. And same is with the instance variable. You don't have static in front of the variables, so it is instance variable. And basically the instance variables are defined under the class level. If you define these variables inside a method, then it becomes a local variables. That is the variables we use in all the time use when you create a method. Any method, if you declare a variable inside a method, that becomes a local variable. So we have done like a lot of programs before, like in which in the main method we have created integer n is equal to integer age. All these things are local to that method, so they are called as a local variables. Here these variables are local to the class and they are not static, so they are the instance variable. If you put a static keyword to it, it becomes a static variables. So let's say this is a normal class, and how we are going to call this class is by creating a main method. So in the main method we are going to create a person class, and we are going to assign p dot first name equal to John, p dot last name equal to Peter, p dot age is equal to 19. So we are giving values for the instance variables once we create an object. And once you give the values for the instance variable, you can call the get full name method, is eligible to vote method. All these behaviors we can call with the instance, you can call with the reference basically, which is p. Down below you see there is one more person object is created. Person p1 is equal to new person of, and p1 dot add person, I'm giving 3 arguments. So what is going to happen here is, instead of doing p dot first name equal to John, p dot last name equal to Peter, p dot age is equal to 19, I just call one method which is p1 dot add person, and this add person is taking 3 arguments, and that 3 arguments is passed to the add person method. And instead of doing it in the main method, we are kind of doing it in the add person, the same logic of assigning the instance variables with the values. So instead of assigning these values in the main method, we are calling a method in an instance method, and then we are passing the values, and that instance method is going to assign the values whatever we pass it to the instance variables. Now we are introducing some static variables. Let's see first, why do we need the static variables? I have introduced 2 variables, total person count and total eligible count, and if you see there is static before it actually. So why do we need static before it? So let's say I wanted to compute total person count and total eligible count. So total person count is here means how many number of person objects I have created. So let's say in this case I have created 2 person objects. We have person P and person P1. We have created 2 person objects. I need to report that count totally how many persons are available. Second thing I wanted to do is I wanted to report a count out of this number of persons available, who are all eligible to vote. What is the total number of eligibility count? So these 2 things I want to calculate. Remember, if you remove the static keyword and if you have them as instance variable, do they make any sense? A total person count is something which is not a property of a person class, right? It's not a property of a person. A person's property can be first name, last name, and age. A total person count cannot be a property of a person itself. Okay, so these variables is at the class level. So we need to define this as static variables because they are not associated with individual object or individual person here. So it is associated with the person class itself. Means I wanted to understand how many objects are created here. So I cannot associate this variable to an individual object. It cannot behave like a first name. So for total person count is a static variable. Means it is associated with all the person objects. It can be shared by all the person objects. It can be updated by all the person objects, and it is not associated with a single instance of a person object. So with that said, how do you basically call them? So I can use p dot total count plus plus, okay, but it is discouraged to use like that because this is a static variable. You should be accessing the static variable in a static way, not in an instance way. Of course, it is not going to give an error for you, but it's going to give a warning saying that static variable should be accessed in a static way if you try to do with p dot total person count, because p is a reference to an instance of an object. But what we are trying to update here is a static variable which is common for all the objects of person, which means it is common for the class. It's a class variable. So I have to use the class name here instead of using the instance name. So I will be putting person dot total person count plus plus. That means I've created one person object, so I'm incrementing the count of the person here, and I'm going to increment the count of the total eligible count variable if this person is eligible to vote. So I'm checking whether this first person object is eligible to vote. If he is eligible to vote, I'm going to increment the count of that another variable. So how do I check if the person is eligible to vote? We have a behavior written already. So we call p dot is eligible to vote, which is going to check whether the first person is eligible to vote. If he is eligible to vote, I'm going to increment the count of total eligible count. The same thing we have to do it with the second person. So instead of writing the program like person dot total person count plus plus if p dot is eligible to vote, all these things, I can put it in the add person method itself. So what I'm going to do is the logic, whatever I have written in here for each person, instead of repeating this logic for each person, I'm putting it in a method, and I'm just adding it to the add person. So whenever you try to add a person, I'm going to uh, whenever you are trying to add a person, you are going to invoke a method p1 dot add person, Chris Smith, whatever names you want to pass, you are going to add that person. And when you add a person, what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect whatever names you are giving and put them in the instance variables. And now since I have added a person, I'm going to increment the total person count, and I'm going to check whether this person is eligible to vote. If he is eligible to vote, I'm also going to increase the total eligible count here. So all these things has been abstracted to a method. So add person contains the logic of instantiating or assigning the initializing the instance variables. Also, it takes care of initializing or updating the static variables. So the last thing is I have written one static method itself. Remember, you see the word static there. So I have, this is not having, it is not just public void print summary, it is having public static void print summary. So why do I instead put a static method here is because I wanted to print the static variables here. So um, public, so I want to print the total persons count here, and then I want to print the total eligibility count. So these are all static variables. I can access the static variables directly in the static method, but I cannot use first name last name like that here in the static methods. I can use that only in the instance method, because if I just do first name, it will, you don't know which person's first name it is, because static is at the class level, so you don't know which person's first name it is, so you're going to get an error. So in the static method you cannot access the instance variables. In the static method you can access directly only the static variables, and not the instance variables. Let's see now the how to call this method. It is just by calling person dot print summary. So I'm not using p1 dot print summary, because print summary is a common method for all the person instances, whether it is p1, p2, doesn't matter. It is a class level method, so I'm accessing with person dot print summary. So let's see how static variables are allocated in memory. So we have this main method. So as you know, um, when you have the main method and you have person p is equal to new person of, the moment you see new person, it is going to create a heap memory. It is going to create a person object basically in the heap memory, and that person object will be reference, it is going to return the memory address, which is 5100, back to the calling place. So person p is going to get 5000 back, 5100 back, so in the stack memory. Now, with the help of the handle P, we can update the values with John, Peter, and 19. So that's what you're seeing in this diagram. And now I create another person P1. So what is going to happen? Another variable, another heap memory location is allocated, and they are populated with Chris, Smith, and 17. And now you got a good, whenever you create objects, it is going to get created in heap, and the references will be in the stack memory. Now, coming to the static variables, what happened to the static variables? Total person count and total eligible count, where it will be. So it will be in the heap memory itself, but it is not going to be getting created every time when you create an object. So just like the first name, last name, and age, it is not going to be created each time. For each person, you are allocating the memory for first name, last name, and age. But for the static variable, you are not going to do that. You are going to have only one location where you are going to have the total person count and total eligible count. So there is a place in the heap memory itself. There is a place in the heap memory itself which is called permgen or metaspace. After Java 8 we call it as metaspace. Before that it is a permgen memory, where you store the class declarations. Anything related to the class level, those things will be stored in that portion of the memory. So this total person count will be created only once for the person class, and the other objects, whatever you have created, is going to share this memory location. So this is how the memory allocation um, works for static variables in Java. So let's see this in by writing some programs in Eclipse. So let's go with Eclipse. Now create a program. We already have person class, so I'm just going to update the same class. So you have a person, first name, last name, age, and stuff like this. So here I'm going to add a method which is going to be public void add person, and this is going to receive three arguments. One is the first name, second one is the last name, and age, right? So we get string first name, string last name, I can put it as ln, and then integer, instead of age I keep it as n, so that I don't conflict with the names what I have with the instance variables. So instance variables is also having first name. I don't want to create first name again here, so that I don't know which one is getting assigned to what. So first name equals fn, that means I'm storing the value of fn into first name. Last name equals ln, and then age is equal to n. So I create and assign these values. So my person object is ready. So if I go with person test, whatever I have done before, I created already some first name, last name, and all this stuff. So instead of doing this way, the better we have already having a method which can do this for us, instead of assigning p1 dot first name, p1 dot last name, all these things. We can just use once you create an object, you can simply say p1 dot add person, and in first name field you can give Chris, and the last name field you can give Smith, and age you can give 10. So if you want to add new persons, all that you need to do is just create a person variable and call this method and change the values. Okay, so and give age here. So you should also be careful here when you copy paste, make it p2, because otherwise it's going to give an error, because you cannot assign the same p1 again. So when you change this as well, make sure that p2 dot add person, otherwise these values will get updated instead of p2's values. Okay, so we have created two persons here and we updated the initial values for them. So now in this add person, we said like we wanted to do a few more things. We wanted to introduce some static variable to capture how many person objects I have created, or how many persons are available. So I'm going to make it as static int person count, person count, and another variable static int eligible count. So in our add person, what I'm going to do is the moment we are adding a person, we are going to increment this variable, person count variable. Each time when you add a person, I'm going to increment the person count variable. And also I'm going to increment the eligible count if he is eligible to vote. So for that I'm calling if is eligible to vote, then I'm going to increment the eligible count as well. So if you notice it here, I didn't put any kind of p dot first name, p1 dot first name, all these things here, because these are all instance method. That means you cannot call this just like a add person. You cannot call from main. If in this person test, I cannot say just like add person. I cannot do this. Why I cannot do this is because, or I cannot say from here I cannot call is eligible to vote. So I cannot just like that call these methods, or even I cannot say, since it is present in the person class, I cannot say like this person dot is eligible to vote. I cannot do this, because if I do this, let's assume we can do this. What will happen is, if you go to is eligible to vote method, here what we are saying here, we are checking whether the age is greater than or equal to 18. So which age, which person's age it is? So because they are instance method, they are not static methods, right? They are not associated with the class. They are associated with the instance of a class. So if I say get full name, if I call just person dot get full name, if I'm asking you, if there are 10 persons in a room and I'm asking, hey, can you give me a full name? So you will be asking who you are asking. Out of 10, whom you are asking. So that is the same question here as well. So you cannot call like just like that person dot is eligible to vote, because we need to say which object I wanted to check here, whether it should be for P1 or it should be for P2 or it should be for P3, whatever person's there. You can invoke these methods for the objects and not for the class, because they are all instance method. The moment you invoke with an object, what is going to happen is, so here if I say go ahead and do p2 dot add person, that means it is going to work with the p2 object. So p2 object means, here p2 object, you are giving a for the p2 person, you are giving his own individual first name last name, so it is going to work with those first name last name and age actually. So that is the reason if I call p2 dot add person, I don't need to worry about it, because it is going to deal with only the p2 person. And when it is dealing with the p2 person, it is also incrementing the person count. This is not the instance variable, but it is a static variable. It is saying once you add a person, I'm going to update the count of person count, and also I'm going to check whether he is eligible to vote, and I'm going to update the eligible count as well. And now you can also write a static method here, and this static method is going to print the summary. Void print summary, and in this I'm going to print sysout to say total persons and give it as total, person count. And I'm going to also print the eligible count. So eligible to vote count is going to be eligible count. Okay. Okay. So now I made I'm just printing the static variables here. Let's see if we print say sysout first name, what is going to happen here? It is the same problem here, right? If I say, if you want to print the first name, it is going to give you an error saying that you cannot, this variable has to be static in order to make this, cannot make a static reference to the non-static field actually. So because why this is saying this as an error is, think about it, if you are saying person dot first name, which person's first name? Because first name is associated with the instance and not with the class. So they are all belonging to, if you go back to the slide, if you see the memory allocation, this total, I mean, if I say in the static block, hey, go print the first name, then the next question will be which person's first name, whether it is this P1's first name or P2's first name. So the next question will be asked like that, right? So that is the reason we are saying we cannot access the instance variable inside a static scope. Actually, static is a class level scope. You cannot access an instance variable inside that directly. So you have to, if you want to access, you have to say whether it is p1 dot first name or p2 dot first name. You cannot just like that access first name here. So only static variables can be directly accessed in the static methods. So let's call this method and we run the program and see what happens here. So I'm going to call the static method using the class name and not p1 dot print summary or p2 dot print summary. Even though it works, it's not a best way to call them. So run this program. Now you see there is totally we created two persons, so listing two, and then out of them one is eligible to vote because the other one is age is 10, so he's not eligible to vote and he's only eligible to vote. So that completes your static methods and static variables.